Good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for being a part of our webinar. This is the 6th session of Microdynamics and it's Building Even Better Compost. Our presenter is Stewart Lundy and I'm Rafael Guzman. I'm a staff member with the Biodynamic Association. And I know that we're probably all Zoom pros at this point, but I'm going to go over a couple of items that will help move our session along as smoothly as possible. First of all, I noticed there was some questions about audio in the beginning, and I want to start there. Our session is being recorded. Those who are registered will get access to a recording of the session to download and use at their leisure for their future. However, when we are in session, we'll be muted unless you were raising a question to Stewart, and that's just for the quality of the recording. You'd be surprised how sometimes just the smallest background noise can build up and kind of break our flow. So please be mindful of that. I think some of you have had the question if your audio is working or if you can, how you can check that. And the best way, which seems counterintuitive, is actually to leave the session and rejoin and make sure that you're connecting with your computer speakers and microphone, and that option pops up when you rejoin the session, and that kind of resets everything. Additionally, if you're having jumpy audio and it's just not streaming smoothly, a good hack is to turn off your camera, and that way your bandwidth is being used specifically for the audio portion. And if you haven't already found the place to turn on and off your camera and your audio, what you can do is use your cursor to go to the bottom bar of your screen on your Zoom screen if you're using a computer, and if you're on an iPad, it's at the top. And click on participant, and then we'll create a pop out to your right hand side with the ability to mute and unmute yourself. At that bottom bar as well is the chat box, and in there you can always drop a question as well. Stuart and I will be keeping our eyes on it, and we'll be able to get to those as well when there's a break in what's being shared. For anything else, you're also welcome to message me directly through the chat if you're having any technical difficulties. And I will also give a little bit of time here if anyone has anything they'd like to ask directly now. Please do so. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to Stewart so we can get started with our evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael. So yes, welcome to Microdynamics 6, Building Even Better Compost. I see some people here who I know are experts at compost, so I hope they have something to add. Yeah, my name is Stewart Lundy. I'm with Perennial Roots Farm in Accomack, Virginia, where we do a little bit of everything, composting being one facet of all the various things. We make our own preparations, we make our own compost, we grow a market garden, we run a CSA, we do meat, medicinal herbs, and we have a relatively young orchard. So it's a bit of everything. But compost is kind of at the heart of it. For me, it's hard to think of biodynamics without thinking of the compost pile. At Steiner's time, in the early 20th century, when he delivered the agriculture course, compost was kind of losing popularity because we finally figured out how to synthesize and fix nitrogen, and it seemed like we could just throw something on the ground and have incredible yields. We'd get bigger sizes, have better weight, but Steiner was one of the early kind of prophetic types who was warning that these one-sided fertilization methods would lead to bloated size, but not necessarily increased nutrition. So he was directing farmers back to that kind of least glamorous of fertilizers, which is the compost pile. So the first question I kind of want to engage today is, well, what is compost? And the curious thing is, we'll get different ideas. There's organic matter, there's organic glues to it. If you go in a bit further, you may even get into some of the science of humus. Though more recently, in fact, in 2015, a scientific paper came out saying that humus, in fact, does not exist. And that may sound confusing for anyone who's involved with organic matter in the soil, who works with compost, but the idea is this. It's that there is no single compound that we can isolate and call humus, because humus is such a confluence, an orchestra of all of these different things, from plants, from vegetables, even minerals weathering down and not quite decomposing into pure dust, but they come right to that edge, and you want them in that colloidal state. And if you're not familiar with colloidal, it's something that's so super fine, so small, that it stops obeying what we think of as like the conventional laws of gravity, where you drop something, it falls. When you have a colloid, it actually is more attracted by the biofield, the electromagnetic field of me or a plant or an animal, than it is to the earth, because it's just reached such a state that gravity doesn't really rule it or its existence anymore. We're after that when we're building compost and trying to convert it into something that can provide the right nourishment for plants. This idea, though, that humus doesn't exist is actually something that Alex Podolinsky in Australia came to himself years before modern science decided humus doesn't exist. He actually said something very similar, which is, there is no single solitary substance that we can identify exclusively as humus, because it is so many things in an ongoing process of decomposition. Humus, in a biodynamic sense, is a living process. It has not fully mineralized, but it has come as close as possible, yet still held together by life. And in that sense, biodynamics was ahead of the modern take on humus not existing as an individual compound. And this is because modern science can really only look at the leftovers, the corpses of things. But it's the same mindset that would tell you that a melody doesn't exist. Instead, it's just a sequence of notes. Or that soup doesn't exist because the only common factor among them all is water. But the absurdity of it is that they are unable to see or perceive that humus as a living process is really what we're after in terms of managing soils, enlivening soils, and working with compost. Steiner himself said the reason that we compost, the reason that we manure and add manure to fields, is to enliven the soil. So that's the goal of compost, and that's something of what it is. But I'm going to read a quote here from Rudolf Steiner about chaos and what we're really after in terms of taking manures and taking plant materials and digesting them into this noble substance that we call compost. And I'll read this in full for everyone who's listening or for the benefit of others tuning in later. Chaos is at the same time the essential reason of the constant and ever-present fertility in nature. Let us take the simple example. The working of chaos appears wherever animal excrements occur. Chaos is working in manure and all that is cast out. And unless, at some time or other, you mingle chaos with cosmos, further evolution is never possible. Now, what you want to think about here is that we need not just order, because order would just be calcification, but not just flexibility. We need order and a hint of disorder. We need chaos and cosmos playing together just like yin and yang. And when we're taking excrement from an animal. It was a plant that had its spiritual idea, but it surrendered its life. It's given up its spiritual archetype and has been rendered to its basic constituents. When an animal excretes manure, it has already rendered that plant into a state of disorder, so to speak, into a state of formlessness, which is really what chaos means. If you even look at the etymology of the word gas, gas comes from the word chaos. This idea of something that is not ordered. It doesn't look like a brick. It doesn't look like a phone. It doesn't look like a rock. It is dancing in the sky. And that comes very close to what we're after with compost in terms of drawing things down to that colloidal state, which really, in its way, behaves more of a gaseous, chaotic state. And that is our target. When we want to balance these substances, we really want to think in terms of polarities. In the moon, we can think of as something wet, heavy, and dark. By contrast, you could talk of the sun as something bright, light, that draws things up. You can see how plants chase it upwards, whereas the roots of plants chase the moon downwards, going after the water and going after humus. The problem that Steiner identified in terms of the lack of nutrition and the problem of spiritual development with humanity was that plants really weren't as well anchored to the living earth, and counterintuitively, because they were not able to receive cosmic nourishment from the atmosphere and from the universe. So you can think of the polarity between sun and moon, but you can also think of the planetary balance of Saturn and moon, which is the innermost celestial body, the one that orbits our Earth, and the furthest most body, at least according to traditional astrology, at least in the West. And these you can see as, one is the heavy, earthen, salty, humus components, and the other is the warming, airy, light. And you're always trying to balance these two. If you get too caught up in the carbon-nitrogen ratio, it doesn't work for all materials. Now, some manures are pretty consistent. Some materials are more reliable than others, but if you look at some of the range of carbon and nitrogen ratios for something like paper, it can be 100 to 1 to thousands to 1. And that's really hard, particularly for a home grower or gardener to deal with, because you're not going to be able to break out a calculator for every single type of material you're adding to the soil. And this is about coming to that balance without having to use a calculator, instead relying on yourself and what you're observing in order to build that pile. Because we can use almost as shorthand. It's almost like cheating. You could say, thinking of the 4 elements instead of reducing it all to numbers. It's not to say the numbers won't work. I have no doubt of that. It's just, how can we use ourselves and refine ourselves as an instrument to create compost? When you have the two in balance, Moon and Saturn, you'll have something that's more of a kaleidoscope of all colors, which can be represented as the full rainbow on the one hand, or as pure white light, which can be broken into the rainbow. And that's really what we're after. This heart, the sun, this gold substance, this black gold, is the process of compost. When we look at these elements, we're going to see, on the one hand, you're going to see fire. And this is not just fire in the sense of a stove or fire in the sense of flames. This is anything that lends towards warming. And there are certain substances, if you pile them high enough, will simply combust. And that's not because you took a match to them, but because they actually have this combustive quality to them and will tend to heat up. If you pile chicken manure too high, it can actually light on fire. And you're going to have to learn to start seeing things in terms of what they would do if you piled them by themselves. If you go further and if you look at watery things, let's say something that's really wet. Certain kinds of manures have different qualities, and they actually reflect an echo, almost a negative, of the animal themselves. So if you have, for example, a goose which has rich goose fat, has downy feathers, it's able to keep itself very warm. But it takes all the warmth out of its food and leaves behind a very wet, sloppy, cold manure. And that's the same with ducks. Likewise, also pig manure is one of the coldest on the farm. If you pile that together and you have nothing but pig manure, it's not going to compost. It's going to get wet, smelly, anaerobic, and really sour. It's not going to be a pleasant experience. You can experiment by piling these things together and in single piles and see what different things turn into. If you pile a large pile of leaves, by contrast to this manure, it's actually going to decompose harmoniously. It just might take a long time. And that's the difference between a substance that has air and something that doesn't. When you think of air, you shouldn't just think of oxygen or the inert nitrogen in our atmosphere, but rather surface area. If you take leaves and you put them through a chipper and pulverize them, all of that extra surface area is surface area to interact with the atmosphere. Really, you're bringing in the air ether at that point. And there's a world of difference between something that has that surface area and something that doesn't. If you were to take, for example, grass clippings, which have a relatively low nitrogen content, and if you're looking at a conventional compost building text, it's not going to indicate that grass is a really good accelerant to heat up your compost pile. Yet if you pile nothing but grass clippings high enough, that also can combust, like actually catch on fire, not just warm up. And the reason for that is, if you think through what it is, there's a bit of water, which is really fuel when it comes to the compost pile. And then there's a lot of air through there. And it's a bit like kindling. If you take little scraps of kindling, it doesn't matter that the material itself may or may not be the hottest burning or have the highest BTUs, but the fact that it has so much surface area, it can burn very quickly, it can heat up, and then cause something else to ignite. So when you think of grass clippings or things that have a very, very fine surface area, you're really thinking of something that there is an expression of air. So when you chip things and reduce them or chew your food, for example, you are really adding air to them, so to speak. And that the surface area is really how the old alchemists thought of the air and light ether, not so much as literal air as we might think or imagine, but as that exposure to air. And then to go further, earth as an element is really an amalgam of all the other three. If you think in terms of like the prototypical elements, there's really fire and there's water. Air is kind of their child. It has aspects of both, like you can recognize a bit of the mother and father. It's warm, but obeys fluid dynamics. If you look at clouds or gases, they go up and want to settle at the ceiling, the way that water wants to fall and settle and find its level on the earth. Air is doing something very much the same, but it wants to go up and out. And that's going to matter for what we discuss further in the compost pile. Earth is a settled state that actually has all of those three other elements and is kind of a fusion of them. But if you're able to attain a harmonious balance of all of these beyond just the earth as an element, you're going to attain what the alchemists called the fifth essence, or what we would say now is quintessence, quintus essentia. The fifth essence you could call ether. There are different names for this, but when you have all four of these intermingling, you have a very different substance that kind of takes it a quantum leap up. It's a totally different octave of the same substance as before. In terms of planetary aspects, we would say this six-pointed star corresponds to the rainbow, to the sun. And this is what we're trying to bring to the compost pile. If you think again in terms of those polarities of Saturn, which I'm showing in the brighter color here, the moon and the darker, if you end up with pill bugs through your compost pile, those little roly-polies, you have a pile that has too much air. If, on the other hand, you're seeing flies show up and maggots, it has too much moon, it's too much water. Those heavy elements are too prominent. if the pile heats up even more than that level of having too much air, you may even see like almost like dust. It looks like ash that will happen through the compost pile because the organic matter in it heats to such a point that it actually combusts on a very small microscopic level and leaves behind this kind of gray ash through it. You'll know you've heated a pile too far if that happens. So on the one hand, you're going to be dealing with air and fire. And on the contrast, you're going to be dealing with earth and water. And it's about balancing these components. And some manures and some elements you can almost pile by themselves and they will transform themselves almost spontaneously into beautiful compost. But learning to think in these different categories is indispensable for the home gardener who doesn't want to be breaking out an Excel spreadsheet every time they want to make compost. And you never know what's going to be available. Some years this produces more, that produces more. And if you start thinking in terms of what people will say green and brown, if you start thinking a little more nuanced in terms of wet and dry, because the brown is usually dry and the green is usually wet. And then you can think too in terms of surface area. So then you're bringing air into it, like those grass clippings. And then if you think further in terms of like, is this really going to heat up? And if you are sensitive to that, you can actually build your compost pile in the right way that it will compost beautifully without even having to turn it. And we'll get into that a little more. I was drawing this today, but we're going to go through some animals. This is after a diagram that Aaron Fried Pfeiffer made. It was never published, but it's a cute diagram, and I decided to put them into some watercolors for this. We're going to go different kinds of manures here and how these might be used differently in a compost pile. On the one hand, you've got your chicken, you have sheep, your horse comes trotting in, there's goat as well, and these are all pretty warm. These are very different from a cow manure or the pig. And I'm just here using the images that are kind of the archetypal animals on the farm. There are others that kind of fit between these, or like alpaca belongs closer to like the sheep or horse than one of the others, but I can't pick every animal for this slide. But these are the warmer ones. And they all have their own peculiar characteristic. And if you read Storrell's book, Culture and Horticulture, he actually goes through and shows how different manures may actually be better suited for different aspects of plant growth. And the cow in biodynamics, of course, is the sacred cow. There is no better manure in biodynamics. There's no better manure for compost. This in herself is balanced. You can almost pile cow manure on its own and get beautiful compost. It just has this natural tendency to go further because she has her 4 stomachs and she's so gentle in her metabolic process and leaves behind so much that you can get compost. A lot of other animals have actually gone through everything that's in the compost and taken it all for themselves, which, you know, that's not very nice for us, but it's really good for the animals. For example, if we go to the next slide here, come on. The pig is able to extract almost everything from its food, and it's even able to extract from the manure of other animals that it wants. And that's part of the reason that pork is looked down upon, is because they're known as filth eaters. And in a way that is true, from my experience on our farm where we have a whole range of animals, is that pigs can't produce their own B vitamins. So where can they get them? Well, ruminant manure is a great source for B vitamins. So pigs will go out of their way, even if it's only a little bit, almost like a supplement, to take excrement from another animal. And the pig, though, because it is so hot and so close to being a human being, that it has too much individuality and it's so warm. The downside to that, though, is that there's very little left behind in the manure. In fact, because it's so hot, it can't even sweat. That's why pigs have their mud wallows, is because they need some way of cooling off. But because they can't sweat and they're so hot and so fatty, the manure they leave behind is completely cold. it's very hard to get it to heat up at all. You'd have to combine it with something like chicken manure to see warmth there at all. So if you go further, I'm going to show you this is very general classification. You could actually go further and make it more nuanced, but these are all the warm ones. Chicken is warm, sheep is warm, horse is warm, goat is warm. The pig is cold. And the cow, I take, is to be very balanced. The cow is just wonderful. And if you go further and you want to know, well, what's like the nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus levels of these? Well, the chicken is mostly phosphorus. The sheep is mostly nitrogen. The horse, generally speaking, is predominantly nitrogen as well, but there's a huge caveat for horse. Even though Pfeiffer lists the horse as predominantly nitrogen, this is only true in its raw state. If you have bedding, like especially if it has sawdust in it, this is often not going to be the case, because if it's too much carbon in there, too much of that woody material from the barn, you're actually not going to have a nitrogen source when you take horse manure. It's actually going to be something more of a carbon source at that point, and will have a totally different character. So if I click that, if you have bedding and horse manure together, you may actually have a predominantly carbon effect, which is a cooling effect on the compost pile, as counterintuitive as that may seem. So you'll have a lot of potassium from the woody material, and you'll have a lot of carbon. The nitrogen will kind of be at the background if you're using horse manure with a lot of bedding. So there's always subtleties to this in the context of where you're getting them that are just worth thinking about. It's also worth considering whether the horses are being wormed, because those wormers are good at killing a whole spectrum of worms, not just intestinal worms. They're good at killing dung beetles and other things through the farm. And dung beetles are one of the best ways for nitrogen to be fixed spontaneously from manure through the field. But if it's killing parasites, it's pretty easy to kill the dung beetles, because they feed off the concentrated juices in the manure, and that's a good way to kill yourself. But also earthworms don't tend to thrive in the presence of those intestinal wormers. So you have to be careful with what you're sourcing if you're looking to build a good compost pile that you want to have earthworms, because they're amazing. We go further, the pig is predominantly potassium. And you can think of all of these together, and that's the goat is also nitrogen. If you know the right ratio for your farm and you're trying to think, all right, how do I get a balanced NPK compost pile? You could just look at the right ratio of animals that you have on your farm and then combine them. You've got a few chickens because you grow eggs for yourself. You've got maybe a pig or two who's like kind of your garbage disposal, processing scraps from the garden, something from the orchard. Then you have more sheep. You maybe have horses for draft, and you have goats. Everyone has a few goats, I assume. But if you were to take all these manures in direct ratio to the presence of the animals on the farm, you'll actually find that it will spontaneously balance itself. The bulk should be ruminants and things that feed off of grasses, things with the fourfold gut. And the rest should be kind of on the sideline. Like the pigs, because they only produce a marketable, sellable product when they're dead, are very expensive animals to keep unless you have a steady stream of scraps from the garden. And that way, pigs are kind of a very special category in all of farm animals, whereas chickens, you can get eggs, sheep, you can get wool or milk, horses, you can get draft power, goats, you can also get milk. And the cow itself, of course, has the best manure, and then also can produce milk as well. So the pig is a curious place in all of this. And again, yes, the cow has this nice balance between these elements. And to be honest, I don't tend to think in terms of NPK numbers, but for anyone who's watching this who comes into this with this will help shift over a mindset to looking in terms of elements and not just the numbers of these primary fertilizers that people like to engage. This is a picture from a friend Rand Carter and one of his compost building setups. And you can see what he's done here. There's produce that's been chopped up. Above that, there's leaves that have been pulverized. In each case, when these things have been chopped up, there's more surface area, which means there's more place more places for life to thrive. There's a permaculture principle called the edge effect, which is anywhere that you can increase the surface area, you're going to increase the spaces available for life. And that's true in the compost pile as well. If you're able to pulverize things even slightly, you're going to end up with a significant increase in terms of the digestibility of everything in the pile. Now, the downside to this is it could accelerate it. Some things won't need to be chopped any further than they were, like grass clippings. And you need to think about possible herbicides that could be on that. If it's from your lawn, it's almost certainly fine. You need to take all of that into consideration. Steiner talks about this curious and in some ways seems out of dated idea when he talks about the scent of an organism. And this actually comes from the miasma theory, which is before the germ theory. And it was that the scent of something is what was infectious. And you can actually see why people thought that and why it was so effective when war hospitals took the smelly patients away from the other ones, is that they couldn't infect because they were out of range. So open air, UV, and the odor couldn't reach. And that was actually some of the beginnings of sewage management was like, oh wait, the odors are infectious. They didn't have the idea that that same cloud sending odors might have been sending pathogens as well, but that the odor itself had that element. So a healthy organism is not going to be radiating its inner body odor. It should actually contain it and circulate that within itself. It's the difference between holding a live hen versus a carcass of a chicken and that meat hands smell that you get when you handle meat. That stink is what should be circulating harmoniously within the organism. If ever it leaks out, it's not a very pleasant smell when you get body odor from another organism, but that also shows that it is not in a healthy place. That same principle governs not just every individual organism, but anything else you try to organize that has life. So that's true of the compost pile, that's true of the farm, and that's true of yourself. So I'll read another quote from Rudolf Steiner that deals directly with this from the agriculture course. Steiner says, "You must make the compost pile smell as little as possible, which you can achieve easily by first laying thin layers of waste material, then something like peat moss on top of that, and another layer of compost materials, etc. Adding these absorptive layers of carbonaceous materials holds the scent together, which otherwise would be lost because nitrogen very much wants to return to the atmosphere and form all sorts of possible connections. Because of nitrogen's strong affinity for the carbon framework, astrality is thus retained." Now, what's interesting about that quote is Steiner's actually talking about, in an oblique way, the carbon-nitrogen ratio. Like, modern science knows there is an affinity between nitrogen and carbon. But Steiner's speaking of it in more of a, these elements have personalities, they have character. You can say who is nitrogen and who is carbon, not just getting these numbers together and expecting everything to work out. Because if you look at the different elements and assess every ingredient you might be putting in the compost pile, straw is going to be relatively cold because there's not a lot of nitrogen. It has a lot of carbon, it's pretty airy, there's a lot of surface area. So it's going to be bringing air, even though it's not bringing nitrogen, but that airiness can accelerate the composting process if it's exposed to something that's also hot. So if you exposed it to a hot manure like horse, and then you added something like straw through it, the two could combust very easily and very quickly reach that thermophilic phase of digestion in a compost pile. So Pfeiffer indicates what we want to do first is dig out a kind of a pit, not a deep pit, no more than a shovel's depth, depending on the size of your pile, and you separate that into a pile beside. You're collecting topsoil in order to add it as almost a reagent throughout the compost pile as you build it. There are two benefits of this. One, it serves as a kind of biofilter because it has that organic living carbon. In addition to that, it also serves almost as Hmm. Almost as a starter culture, because you'll have fermented the topsoil, the same topsoil that you want this compost to help your plants unlock in the garden. So adding your topsoil to your compost pile and then it fermenting will unlock the nutrients in there, but also breed and culture and direct specific forces that will help your other plants unlock the rest of the garden. This really can't be overemphasized. Aaron Fried Pfeiffer's recommendations was actually to add at least 5% of biomass to your compost pile of your soil, if it's clay. If it's sandier, you're going to have to add proportionally more, probably 10%, maybe even 15%, because you're after that clay component. And you want this layered in order to build that good clay humus complex. Some people will add, and I've done this myself, add something like the volcanic clay azomite, which is a brand name, through their compost pile in order to stimulate and direct this process forward. So having dug this pit, you'll settle things down into the earth itself where it has direct contact as much as possible. You can't do this everywhere. In some countries, you have to have a platform. And just practically speaking, sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. But you put a layer in there. And here I'm going to use the colors of cold and hot. And then the orange I'm going to be using for the earth. So you layer something in, you cover it with earth. You layer something hot, something cold, you layer it with earth. Every step you should cover the outside with another layer of earth. And this can be earthy. Steiner does talk about peat moss, though in terms of sustainability, that's not something that everyone recommends these days. You might consider coconut coir, which is much more sustainable, though you may have to be concerned a little bit with the salt content there. You just might have to think about that. You need to do your research on that theme, but the numbers are out there. Every time you layer, you should be adding a dusting of topsoil on the top. Because a compost pile will develop a mineralized skin, just like the outside of our skin. This part's dead. Everything you can see of me, this, my eyes, everything on the outside is dead. And it would be very, very rare for you to see anything that wasn't. The compost pile will develop a mineralized skin unless you have a fleece or a tarp or something that you keep on the outside, or also you can use your own topsoil to serve as that skin. By adding these layers of topsoil, you're actually going to massively decrease the pressure from vermin and pests because the scent will not escape. And the farmer Joel Salatin likes to say that the smell of manure is the smell of manure mismanagement. And Steiner, in his own particularly idiosyncratic way, he says that every organism should stink inwardly. So the stink and the smell of the compost pile should be kept inside. And if it doesn't, you can think of it more pragmatically as if odors escaping from the compost pile, that's nutrients and that's money escaping from the compost pile. That is valuable nourishment for the farm. And when those forces are escaping and you can smell them escaping, or flies can, or vermin can, you're already losing stuff that you don't even see that you're losing. So this process continues. You do something warm, and then something cold, and then once more, finally, you cover the whole thing with the rest of the soil. This process is what Pfeiffer recommends and is a very good way of creating a harmonious compost pile without having to go through a lot of turning. You can turn it. That's not going to hurt anything. If you have the equipment to do it, absolutely do it. But every home grower making their own compost, adding a bit of their own topsoil, will find remarkable, almost miraculous results. In part because 99% of all minerals in the soil are not showing up on soil tests. They're still locked up. But if they undergo to the amazing orchestra of life in a compost pile, new things will be unlocked because there's an unbelievable diversity of reactions happening within that compost pile, which then will loosen and free up minerals that you didn't realize were available in your own soil. Now, something you will want to consider dusting in this earth layer. This doesn't strictly have to be topsoil. It can be biochar. It can be minerals itself. You may even also want to consider adding lime to your compost pile, even though in the form of quicklime. This, according to Steiner, has the ability to kind of suck up excessive ethericity. So when the pile is almost too wet and you want to help dry it out, but without removing the moisture, but you want to allow that astral quality to connect to what water is there and to combust it. When you think of the water ether, it's really almost better to think of it in terms of like a combustion reaction, and that what you're really looking at is water is like fuel, and the fire is what burns that fuel, that there's a combustive relationship between the two. And when you have the fire and water interacting, you then get air and light combusting and this expansive pressure, even warmth and light moving outwards. And then the fallout, the leftovers of that reaction is the earth element, which has a bit of all of them. So I like to think of the compost pile in terms of this gradient of warmth as well. And when you look here, the coolest part of the pile is almost always going to be at the base, and the warmest is going to move to the top because warmth likes to move up and likes to go towards points. You can, if you're careful, particularly with those different kinds of manure, if you were to build the base of your pile with the warmer compost materials and then gradually build to the wetter, colder materials, you can take advantage of the compost pile's natural tendency to heat at the top and cool at the bottom. So hottest elements at the bottom, coldest at the top, the wettest at the top. So when the wet leaks down, it interacts with the warm stuff at the bottom, and the two end up playing together, and you end up with a more homogeneous heat, even without turning. And it doesn't take a ton of planning. We're just talking about the bottom third's one thing, the middle third's something more moderate, and the top third is something of the colder, wetter materials. We're not talking, it's not rocket science. But learning to develop that level of sensitivity towards what materials you're using, even just these ideas that I'm sharing now, having those will change how you see everything you're looking at in terms of why you're building it. And you're not eventually going to even think of what is the nitrogen content of this at all, because at the end, the nitrogen will find the carbon. For example, if you take a big pile of wood chips and they're fresh and green, there's not going to be a lot of nitrogen there. But if you leave them there to the point that they blacken, they're soaked with water and they're covered with organic life, and that composting reaction is already happening. And bacteria are covering everything, fungus is showing up. And the single most nitrogen-rich thing in the soil is bacteria. So the fact that you leave something carbonaceous long enough and then it blackens, you already know that that carbon-nitrogen ratio is already totally transformed, and the process is moving more towards that colloidal chaos state, even if it may take time. Now, for the home grower or anyone doing small-scale compost, perhaps even larger, but anyone doing small-scale compost or something like barrel compound, there's an idea I came up with a few years ago, which is using a copper pipe. And this is based off Victor Schauberger's implosion principles, but also just the nice ability of copper to radiate heat evenly. There's a reason chefs like to use copper, is because if you heat one portion of it, the entire sheet of copper tries to heat to the same temperature. So if you have this copper pipe in your compost pile that bridges the cold area and the warm area, you almost have this geothermal action going, because the warm end of the copper is always going to be radiating heat down into the cold area, and vice versa. You can actually be moving against the compost pile's natural tendency to move heat upwards. You can actually be moving heat downwards, because the copper is always going to be colder than the hot part, but warmer than the cold part of the compost pile. And that causes this circulation. I like to put good finished compost into this copper pipe, or water, because that water circulating, the water also will be dancing and radiating heat and gives it some thermal mass, not just straight metal. I found that when I use this on a barrel compound, it's often finished weeks, if not months, in advance of some of the others. And I credit this primarily because of the heat diffusion. There may also be the activity that you now have a shaft and there's some air, so I may have introduced that, but I've seen some significant results with this. And there are ways of scaling this up, I'm sure, but this is a really interesting thing that I found that just accelerates compost quality. So when we look at the compost pile, we're thinking of the direction of these elements. Air is breathed in through the sides and then moves up into it, and then through the outside, through the top, you're losing warmth, you're losing water, and you're losing air. What's left behind is going to be earth. The reason you do these laminations, or at least cover the top with something that can be a biofilter for these elements, is you want to retain warmth, and you want to retain water, and you want to retain what Alan Chadwick called noble gases, these vital gases that will leave the compost pile. You're going to lose some warmth. You can't do anything about that. Some water, can't do anything about that. Some air, that's fine. But you want to slow that process down in order to trap as much as you can. So for Chadwick, you actually wanted to leave the sides relatively open so that they can breathe in and cause this chimney effect that then pulls elements up through those laminations. But by the end, it comes out scentless, without odor. Now that's the basic idea of how we're trying to structure this. And to get this to happen, you have to build a pile big enough. There's a certain amount that you have to build. Just a piddly little pile is not going to cut it. You're going to have to make it to a certain mass in order to get this reaction. And in that sense, I'm not a fan at all of those compost tumblers. They're too fast. You're losing almost all the water, all the air, and all the warmth, not to mention a lot of the scent, because it tends to attract pests unless you fill it all at once and get it rolling. I'm not a huge fan of that. But that's me personally. Some of you may have had good experiences with it. This next slide, I'm going to think about the different shapes you might build your compost pile. And this isn't to be esoteric or even get into something like sacred geometry. It's just you can make compost do different things by building it in different ways. If you build a compost pile so it has a peak, this is going to shed the most water. The top is going to get hot, but it will shed the most water. So if you get a lot of rainfall or you're building it in the rainy season, you may want to build it in such a way that the compost pile quickly sheds water, and this may be your shape. If, on the other hand, you're building it during a drier season when you will want to collect water, because if a compost pile ever dries out, it just stops. The biology cannot do anything. There cannot be life without water. Everything etheric about the pile just comes to a stop. If you build it with a kind of a trough in the center of it, this will actually collect a moderate amount more of water and could help keep it moistened through the season. It's going to depend on where you are and what you're after. This is the shape, this trapezoid. This is what Ehrenfried Pfeiffer recommends, which is it has a flat top and a flat bottom. The bottom is slightly wider than the top, and it tapers. This is a very nice way to build, and it can make a very tidy compost pile. It radiates more heat, but it still can collect a bit of water because honestly, it tends to slump a little bit in the center and become the image that we see on the left. But if it's well maintained, it's going to shed a significant amount of water. A nice balanced pile, which I kind of like, is a rounded one. This is one that Victor Schauberger favored, though his was actually a little bit more of an egg shape than a dome. So it kind of incorporates the triangle and the sphere together to have an egg shape. This will shed a significant amount of water as well. In this slide, I made these to show you how the water will shed off of these different kinds of compost pile. You can see the second one, a lot's going to be diverted to the center, and you may want that. Now, a pile that gets too wet, that's not going to go well. But a pile that dries out is just not going to do anything. So Ehrenfried Pfeiffer recommended for every grower who's making compost that they should have river birches around their composting site. And he even went so far as to say, if they cannot be found in the area, you must buy them in. They have that much of a good effect on the compost pile, just by their roots growing into the compost. One of the reasons is that river birches grow in waterlogged, like snotty conditions around the riverbeds, thus river birches. But these riparian zone trees don't suffer from getting waterlogged. Their roots don't get lodged. And because of that, they can impart that same power to your compost pile. If you plant trees that do not ever get waterlogged, do not suffer from excess moisture around your compost pile, assuming they're not a heavy feeder, they can actually prevent your compost pile from getting wet feet and going anaerobic. And that's incredibly valuable. In addition to that, river birches are a non-leguminous nitrogen fixer. So they will actually fix nitrogen into your compost pile, even though they're not in the bean family. Steiner has similar, Pfeiffer has similar positive things to say about elderberries, and that you should have those around your compost pile as well. Those are not nitrogen fixing, but they also are riparian zone shrubs that don't suffer from having their roots wet. They can impart that power to your compost pile. And that's really a remarkable idea of basically they will always draw off excess moisture from that compost pile. It's just, I think it's nearly miraculous when you think of what can be done with that. The flat topped one, some will come down, but a lot of it will be shed. The rounded one, it's a bit more balanced, more forgiving. But some of you are actually going to find yourselves in the uncomfortable situation where if you leave it up above the ground, it may just dry out, or it's too hot. One of these, if you have either of these as a problem, you may actually want to sink your compost pile into the ground. As much as this may seem to defy some of Steiner's indications of building it up increases ethericity, I'll say there's some places got plenty of ethericity. You actually need to slow some of this down. If you build the pit, it's the same principle as building a compost pile above ground. The difference is you just dig it deeper. You add your hot, cold earth, and then you have your compost pile. When this rains, you're going to get a lot of water that'll go down into there because you basically built a grave for your compost pile, and any water that comes all at once will move into there. If you end up with too much rain, you can just cover it with plywood or tarp to divert it during an especially rainy season. But this will keep the compost pile cooler, slow down the metabolic process, and if you're more in the tropics, you may find that this serves better than a pile mounded up. It's going to depend. It really will. You may end up building more of like as if it's built into a hill. So it's like a three-sided pit where you can just lean a piece of plywood on the end or some sort of covering, and then you can like drive your tractor into it, or if you're with a tractor. But that way you can just shovel it out directly, put it into your carts. But hilling it up and surrounding it with that earth will protect it from the excesses of warmth, the excesses of dryness. It's the same reason we hill up leeks, is to stop it from getting the excesses of those atmospheric effects, the excesses of warmth and light that would turn the leek green. We want it to stay blanched. This will help keep things tender and green, particularly in areas where they would want to dry out and turn brown, if that makes sense. Okay. This next section, we're going to talk a bit about the biodynamic preparations and their significance. Now, some of you may not have biodynamic preparations on hand. Some of you may not be familiar with them. So I'm going to talk primarily here about the herbs themselves. There's a work by May Bruce, which is Common Sense Composting. I'm going to type that in. And May Bruce, Common Sense Composting, is available for free online. She accepted the biodynamic principles and took it to a different direction. She used the herbs themselves. She found that when she didn't use the preparation, she had to use a lot more of these medicinal herbs to get the same beneficial effect. Patrick is asking about swampy areas. That applies. The river birch and the elderberries apply to that. If you have a particularly swampy area, you're going to want to build it up off the ground with a lattice work of something that makes sure that it drains. But if you were to have river birches and elderberries there, that would probably solve most of the issue. So first one we're going to talk about is chamomile. And chamomile is a fascinating plant to put into the compost pile. There's an herbal text that I believe Steiner referenced in his putting together the biodynamic agriculture course, which is by W.T. Fernie. It's a 1914 book. And he says that, I'll read you some of the benefits of chamomile and why you'd want this in your compost pile. Quote, "It is remarkable that each chamomile is a plant physician, since nothing contributes so much to the health of a plant garden as a number of chamomile herbs dispersed about it. Singularly enough, if another plant is drooping and apparently dying, in 9 cases out of 10, it will recover if you place an herb of chamomile near it." He goes on to say, "It has been found eminently beneficial to employ chamomile flowers boiled in tripe broth, intestines," which to me sounds an awful lot like the preparation that we use in biodynamics. Someone's asking, can you suggest what home gardeners who don't have access to animal manure can use to build a pile? In short, everything in your garden, and you'll be looking for wet things, you'll be looking for dry things, you'll be looking for and you'll want to layer those together. If you don't have manure, you're going to have a harder time getting the balance that you want, but you'll want to make a point of bringing something of an animal nature to that. So in particular, you're going to want to be using lime, even quicklime, which you have to be careful with because it is caustic. But if you bring that to the pile, you will stop it from going into more of a sauerkraut direction. If you do a vegetarian compost pile, the tendency is going to be to turn into a kind of bokashi, lactobacillus, sauerkraut, kimchi direction. That's a direction that you go. If you're able to get some manure from a dairy, you can dilute it in buckets or even large barrels, and then use that to kind of wash each layer so that you have some of that animal impulse, the digesting animal direction throughout the compost pile. If you really are not able to bring in any manures at all, you should have an earthworm bin. And I'm going to get to that a little later because that could be your livestock. You may only raise earthworms, but all of us have livestock, even if they're invisible. Rand is sharing a very good reference from Gardening for Life from Maria Thun. "Plants cultivated for several years with only vegetarian compost increasingly lost their capacity to develop fully, failing, for instance, to produce a full head of cauliflower or lettuce." This is a really important point. If you build your compost pile primarily out of leafy vegetation, leaves, guess what? It's going to stimulate leafy growth when you grow out of that. You need something that has more of the astral element, which animals can bring. But if you target your weeds, particularly your medicinal weeds, even things you might think of as poisonous, those have an element of astrality that is descended into the plant. And that's precisely what makes them medicinal. So these herbs that we're talking about, they really are poisons, but they're poisons that counterbalance the opposite imbalance in yourself. So each of these is a kind of plant poison that helps restore that astrality that may be that may be missing. That's part of the reason that animal sheaths are used as well. It's to direct it in that way. Yeah, I'm going to move to the next one, which is yarrow. Yarrow helps separate the coarser juices like urine and urine salts from the more refined procreative juices. And you have to have this separation occurring, and that's why they are loosely associated with the kidneys, and Steiner says what's occurring between the kidneys and the bladder, but not just what's between the kidneys and the bladder. These really do have remarkable power for healing. In human beings, they have the ability to dissolve clots, but they also have a styptic effect. They'll stop internal bleeding. They dissolve cysts. They even have a plant analog to human growth hormone, which we need anytime we grow, maintain, or regenerate any of our organs. As we age, we produce less and less human growth hormone, and yarrow is a nice companion for life. Most people could benefit from yarrow. Like of all these herbs, if I were to choose one, it would be yarrow. And if you look at what Mae Bruce indicates, she says that yarrow and nettles, of all the compost preparations, do most of the work. If you were to have to isolate yourself to only two, and I see no reason to isolate yourself to only two, but if you had to, nettles and yarrow are kind of real power horses in this entire reaction. When you look at nettles, this is a truly remarkable plant. Steiner refers to it, at least in translation, as a kind of jack of all trades. He's good at everything. Matthew Wood, in his herbal text, The Earthwise Herbal, says, when in doubt, give nettles. And I really believe that's true. It has all essential amino acids, plus a few extras, which is really nice. It has calcium, iron, magnesium. It has a good deal of silica as well. It's just kind of everything. It's a truly remarkable plant. This is one of those substances, like cow manure, which if you pile nothing but nettles, you will get beautiful compost. Alan Chadwick actually talks about building a compost pile out of nothing but stinging nettles. And in 3 days, he had finished humus. Like 3 days, not 3 weeks, not 3 months, 3 days. And if there was nothing else you added to your compost pile, it really should be nettles. It is a champion at balancing the entire compost pile. Steiner says it belongs growing around the human heart. And it is one of those plants that specifically helps to address what Rand was mentioning, that inability to head up. And you can't overdo nettles. Of all of the herbs, Steiner says you only need a little. But of nettles, he says, gather as much as you can. And I don't think that's a mistake. We should really take that as a cue that we should be just loading our compost pile with as much nettles as we can. If you don't want it to become a weed, cut it before it's gone to seed, and then just make sure to layer it in. And you will have some of the best compost you've ever seen. One element that Steiner recommends is oak bark. And he says this is a virtual prophylactic against any plant ailment that's due to like a excess of ethericity. And having this tannic quality, it has that astringency, and then it has a high amount of calcium, which works as almost a kind of organic lime. You make your own lime by using oak bark through your compost pile. And this is a clear carbon-based material. This would be a wonderful thing to layer through your compost pile as much as you would coconut coir. It is a remarkable substance. Now, Alan Chadwick actually found in his experience that building his compost pile underneath an oak tree, because it was one of the best places to get the best conversion. If you look at all the different trees that grow, oak is remarkable in the sense that it's not specialized. It grows everywhere in some form. It is not the best at anything, but it is kind of second or third at everything, which makes it kind of the best generalist tree. And even in terms of biodiversity, Pfeiffer writes about oak as being the only tree that he knows of that thrives in monoculture. Almost anything else can establish a monoculture, but over time it becomes sickly. Oaks, though, actually not only do well in monoculture, but they actually have a spontaneous tendency to create polyculture. If you look under a pine tree and see how many species are germinating under its pine needles, it's not going to be a lot. But if you look under an oak tree, you'll find 30 different kinds of plants trying to emerge there. It is a wonderful balancer. And if you can't plant your compost site directly under an oak tree, oak leaves would be a wonderful addition if you can't do that. But being in the presence of that tree, there's this cloud, what Steiner refers to like a cloud of astrality around it. You can smell it. There's a scent around the tree that just permeates the compost pile and has this almost aromatherapy effect on the pile, but in a concrete way. Another plant that Steiner references in terms of these preparations is the dandelion, which brings these, he talks about silicic acid and potassium, but when he says potassium salts, he's often talking about all of these kind of alkaline salts. And when he talks about this other pole, he's often talking about these acidic elements. For him, This is something that brings the acidic and alkaline elements into balance, specifically silicic acid and the soluble alkaline salts. This is a wonderful plant to have, and it has this remarkable pH balancing tendency, which works well with the oak bark. And again, these are things that you can add to your pile whether or not you've made the preparations. If you haven't made the preparations, you may just have to put a lot of dandelion flowers and leaves through your pile to kind of get to the same level of effect because you haven't concentrated it beforehand. I'll show, I made a little animation of these, the radiant properties of these preparations. And yeah, I'll show you. When you put a pinch of salt in water, you don't have to shake the water in order for it all to become salty. Just the principle of diffusion works here. And that's why the compost pile needs to stay moist so that it can have this organic, etheric, watery, radiating property. You put these preparations in, if the pile's dry, what are they going to do? Like, the pile has no water, it has no life. It has to have that moisture for these things to do their activity. Now, the preparations have been reduced to that perfect colloidal state already. That's what makes them so useful. And that's why they want to spread through all the pile and like almost infect it, but in a benevolent way. So you put a prep in, its effect radiates outwards. You put another one in, its effect likewise moves through the whole pile. You put another, it radiates outwards. Again, energy always moves from high concentration to low. It's like putting a pinch of salt in one part of a cup of water, the whole thing becomes salty. They all become prepped, so to speak. And the result is you've transformed it all and you get true colloidal humus. For those who are interested in this, I've been offered an opportunity from Rand, who is suggesting that anyone who is interested in some of these preparations, there's a number of them from the late Hugh Courtney's estate. If you were to email Rand Carter, whose email address is in the chat here, he should be able to hook you up. Thank you, Rand. That was very generous. So this slide is from Steve Diver. The one on the left is a microscopic view of unfinished compost, what you would buy commercially as sold as compost. And then on the right is true colloidal compost, which has been reduced to this colloidal anonymity. Yeah, Rand, if you could put your offer in the chat, other people would be able to read it. I'm not going to be able to copy it right now, it seems. So we want, if you were to look under a microscope, you shouldn't have to, because you can see it, feel it, and see whether it's colloidal. You should be able to put it in your hands, smear it, and it's just anonymous. It might look like there was some structure left, and it was just a goat. If we move to this next slide, this is those zoomed out. On the left is what is often sold as manure compost, which is, you can see it's not totally transformed. You can see parent material. There's no odor, so it is deodorized manure, but it hasn't reached that colloidal anonymity, which is what you see on the right. And that's really our target, because we talked about why we want that. This allows the plants to choose whatever they want from the compost at will. Whereas the stuff on the left, it's going to have to wait for some of it to decompose. It's not that the stuff on the left is necessarily going to harm the soil, but it is not the like super vitamin that colloidal humus really is. So someone asked about what to do if you don't have animals. Earthworms, 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 earthworms. This is another photo credit of Rand Carter. These critters are probably your best friend and the best friend of any home grower. They are able to convert vegetable scraps, your own food, waste from the garden, into the most beautiful and balanced substance you can, a quintessence, if you will. There's a quote from Steiner that really gets to the heart of this, and it is that, quote, "These golden creatures, which are of such special significance for the earth, are earthworms. Earthworms must be studied in the context of their interactions within the earth. These wonderful animals leave the earth exactly as much ethericity as it needs for plant growth. Now, if the word etheric or ethericity is causing you trouble, swap it out with the word vitality, and it may make a little more sense. But Steiner even refers to these earthworms as release valves. They're releasing excess vitality, and that's why if you have pure earthworm castings, particularly if there's not too much salt in it, it's a wonderful boon for plant growth. Really can be. But these can be your livestock. You may not have cows. You might have to buy in preps, but you can produce almost everything you need from your own resources, particularly if you focus on the earthworm. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer's own research on the composition of the 500 horn manure found that there was a lot of overlap between the bacterial population of earthworm castings and the 500 horn manure. There's a real kinship there between what he saw happening in the one and the other. There are significant differences in terms of their effects and maybe their spiritual meaning, but in terms of their biological activity, Steiner found that there was a lot of similarity. It's not to conflate the two. But we need to continue to think in terms of these elements. And it's not something a lot of us have spent a ton of time thinking about, because it's an unusual way to approach things. It's, in some ways, it seems very foreign to our everyday thinking. It's just like, who thinks like that anymore? Steven's asking a question. Can you talk about using fresh versus older months to years old cow manure, as well as wet and young versus old? What are your preferences and how do you like to use it? Steiner talks about what happens if you dry out manure. He says that you lose the astrality, which is in the fluids, and you lose a lot of the ethericity, which is in that sponginess, and you're left with more of what he calls the spiritual element of it. So when you dry cow manure patties or burn it, you're getting the spiritual aspect without that etheric astral part. So how to restore that? You would have to draw on something else that has what would be like pure etheric forces. Conveniently, my memory is working, and Steiner refers to milk as pure etheric forces. There is almost nothing better for the soil than a milk spray. Similarly, I would go so far as to say that, a milk spray on the dried out manure would bring back cow vitality to that manure, if that makes sense. That's how I would address old manure. Steve's also asking, other than killing weeds and pathogens, what is the virtue of compost reaching 140, 150 degrees? Do you think thermophilic microbes are most favorable? Can you talk about the consequences of temperatures past 150? What temperatures should we aim for? Well, Pfeiffer's indications are actually that we shouldn't exceed 120, because everything over that temperature, enzymes start to break down. Now, as a consequence, the same thing happens when we want to kill weed seeds. We're going to have to destroy some enzymes to do that, so it has to be hotter than that. But Pfeiffer's recommendation is to bring it to the range of, I'm trying to remember the temperatures now. I think he said between 105 and 120. That was Pfeiffer's ideal range. And if it ever gets too hot, and everyone should have a thermometer for their pile, and it should be one with handles, so you're not pushing on the face of it, something with handles so you can stick it into the pile, so you can get a good sense of the temperature. If it ever gets too hot, or you see it just passed 120, that's fine. Just water it, and it will bring the temperature back down. Let's see. Rand says that he has made humus balls of compost and sits in water forever without losing form. And yet he can't get that with earthworm humus. That's very true. If you take some of the finished 500 XP, which is 500 horn manure plus the compost preparations, you can ball that up. And I think I've shown that in some other slides from my previous presentations, which are available free online if you look at biodynamics.com. But you can put that in water, and the humus has more attraction to itself than to water. Again, that colloidal property that stops obeying what we think of as day-to-day laws of physics. Someone's asking about bagged steer manure. Depends on where it's from. Like, they're probably fed antibiotics. Who knows what else they've been fed. If they're fed on corn, the manure is not going to be as good as if it was grass-fed. You would have much more luck if you're able to contact a farmer somewhere in the area, and you'll find that most of them are pretty generous with their manure. You might have to collect it yourself, but like, that's something that farmers tend to have a lot of, and you may end up finding that you develop a nice friendship with that farmer. Someone else is asking, I've heard about Korean natural farming where they use fermented weeds and spray them on plants as well as milk. What qualities would you suppose this may bring to the garden or compost? Korean natural farming is an excellent approach, and there's a lot of kinship between it and what the biodynamic preparations are after, though I'll say most of their preparations tend to be the acid side of things, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's going to be milk, vinegar, sauerkraut, kimchi, that direction. It can be a wonderful soil stimulant, don't get me wrong, and it's wonderful particularly if you have a small space and you want to raise animals in it and you can't rotate. If you keep spraying that, parasites can't live, flies can't lay their eggs and have them live. There's a lot of benefits to keeping an acid dominant culture. Steve's asking, can wet manure stay potent, preserved for many months in a plastic bucket with a lid? I don't know. That's not how I've kept it. Honestly, though, the gases can't get away. I'm trying to think what would happen there. It might work. I would probably, if I were putting things in buckets, I don't know, that's moving me more into the Korean natural farming direction, which isn't quite what I wanted to address. But if you mixed it with some biochar, it would probably last a lot longer, and by the time you opened it, may transform into a more benevolent substance. Might not have so much offensive odor. Someone's asking about, worrying about manure contaminated with persistent herbicides. This is one, again, where if you're buying it bagged, you don't have a clue. And that may be one of the benefits of heating it to that 140, 150 that Stephen was asking about, is that you don't know what's in it. If you heat it hot enough, a lot of things break down, but you lose a lot of the benefit too. This is where you really do want to develop a relationship with a farmer, or in some ways have your own animals, even if it's just rabbits, and you're able to divert the manure without urine to the worms. Do not put rabbit urine and rabbit manure in a worm bin. The worms will leave and you'll have them all over your yard trying to find a new home. And don't do that. Let's see. Should you just make a worm bin and then add finished earthworm castings to the compost pile? That wouldn't hurt, but you could also add finished earthworm castings, either diluted and spray them out as a soil stimulant. You could add them together with the milk, let that sit overnight, and then stir it a little bit and spray that to keep that as a stimulant. If you can't keep something and use it immediately, I make it in piles. That's how I do it. And if you're able to cover it in a tarp, you'll start the decomposition process, and when you move it, you end up, that's a turning process. So it's not going to have a harmful effect to it. If you've got cow manure that's fresh and it's too wet, sometimes you do want to let it dry out a little. But if you're able to layer in, I'm a big fan of biochar, particularly as a powdered form. If you're able to layer that in, you may come back to it and go, wow, this is really good. I didn't do anything to this. But biochar is how I like to manage things that have to sit. That's not universal, but you asked about cow manure, so I'm thinking the wet materials. That's how I think of it. I like to tarp things. Let's see. There are a lot of questions. Where can you find a recipe for a milk spray? If you look online for milk and honey spray, the honey in particular adds its own benefits, but you end up with these. It's a wonderful thing to do. So if you Google that online, I don't have the recipe offhand, but that also can be diluted pretty strongly and has some really remarkable results. Who was I talking to? I was talking to, a local farmer just across the border in Maryland, and he was saying that he knows somebody that's growing the same seed as everybody else from the same company, and they ask for pictures from their different customers, and he sent a picture, and they're like, what are you doing to your crops? And he's like, I don't do anything. Like, he didn't do anything. He didn't spray. He didn't think of anything or he didn't do herbicides, fertilizers, anything. And they said, well, but what do you put on your field? And he ended up saying, he's like, oh, right. My brother has a dairy. I use all this, like the spoiled skim milk, and I just spray that out every time it's there. So he had the luscious, best growth because he kept bringing in these sugars. And keep in mind, humus is more than 50% carbohydrates. So when you bring in things like milk with these sugars or molasses, you don't want to over sugar your soil because that makes it like it's, addicted to sugar. But you can bring these in and use that as a stimulant, and you will find really remarkable results. And it's also a good thing to add to your compost. It won't hurt to add milk to your compost. I think it was Enzo Nastati who recommended to jumpstart a compost pile that's gone cold is to take a loaf of sourdough, soak it in organic red Concord grape juice, and dig that into the heart of the pile and bury it again. His claims is that the entire pile will wake back up, and it has almost this Eucharistic feel with those two things. But that's his claim. I haven't tried that from experience, so I can't testify to that. But I hope that's helpful. Yeah, and if you do want the preparations, do contact Rand. Rand's a cool dude, and he will hook you up. But I wanted to go through and kind of classify different materials, but I realized that's almost an entire presentation on its own. How do I classify straw or nettles or this or that? I wanted to highlight a few of those like benevolent balancing ones like biochar, cow manure, nettles. Just really good, reliable ones. Rands is giving a recipe in the chat, which I'll read out because this looks comparable to what I've used. For an acre, something like a pint of milk can be added to 3.5 gallons of water, stirred for 20 minutes and sprayed in the late afternoon. Honey can be applied at a rate of 1 ounce to 3.5 gallons of water an acre. Potentized similarly for 20 minutes and sprayed in the morning. Multiply this as needed. I've combined a milk and honey spray. It's actually, that was their kind of the old original mead recipe, was honey and milk in Egypt, and it was used as sacramental food. They didn't use it to get drunk. It was a ritual thing, the same way that lettuce was used ritually and wasn't a food. Just odd things that have just become so commonplace. But the fascinating thing is that the things we're talking about now, a lot of this would have been secrets that only the alchemists and people who were initiates would have had. But now it's everywhere. But we've forgotten the sacred quality of the things, which is why we can use them. Like the plow used to be sacred. These elements used to be considered sacred, but we can use them because we've forgotten that quality. But in a way, I don't mean to return to superstition, but coming back to a reverential attitude around the compost pile, yeah, that's really a direction. It almost needs to become more of an altar space. But that's the mood we need to take into the future of composting, and I hope this helps move us there. So. And I think that's basically it. If we have a question or two more, I'm going to scroll back up and see. I do have a couple questions I didn't get to. Someone's asking, which preps do we use in the compost pile and when do we add them? It's a good question. I like to add them when the compost pile is built. If you're building it all at once, add them then. They should be at least a foot from the surface. They don't have to be much deeper than that, but they should be backfilled, so that their radiant property kind of flows and diffuses through the entire pile. You use all of them, and I put them at different points through the pile. Nettles in the center, you have chamomile here, you've got yarrow here, you end up oak bark and dandelion, and then valerian, there's some debate over how it's used, but generally speaking, people stir that and spray it almost like over the skin of the compost pile. Other people use valerian to activate phosphorus when spreading the compost, but both might work. I don't have enough experience to say which is better. Rudolf Steiner, being more of the German persuasion, is more of the German chamomile persuasion as well. You can look. I would look up to see which ones tend to be the stronger medicinal plant, because they're both They're both similar, but Steiner does say that I think the stinking chamomile would not be as good as the German chamomile. Oh, if you have whey, use whey. Yep. If you've got skim milk, whey is absolutely wonderful. In some ways, it's better than skim milk, but whey it's absolutely incredible if you have access to that. And you can use that on your compost pile too. That's a way to bring the animal quality to the compost pile when you don't have animals. So, all right. I think that's about it, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Stewart. And thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. And just want to share that our next webinar from Stewart will be, oh, forgive me, I'm trying to get the correct date up here, will be our Microdynamics Series 7, Empowering Your Garden with Biodynamic Herbs, and that will be on September 10th. So I hope you'll join us then. That information can be found for registering on our website. And I want to wish you all well and good health, and have a wonderful evening.